Welcome everyone to the Institute for Public Knowledge. My name is Eric Kleinenberg. I'm the director here, also a professor of sociology here at the university. For those of you who are new to the IPK, welcome. We're really happy to have you here. This is a part of the university where we really try to take the public engagement of universities seriously and to be a place where people who work in the university and people who don't work in the university can come together and share ideas and learn from one another. So we have a lot of faculty and students here who are working on different kinds of projects and doing original research. And we think these are people who have a lot to teach, but we also recognize how much we have to learn from opening the doors and making sure we all get together. And so we do a lot of convenings like this. We have lots of different themes that we address, but one of the core themes that we've always addressed here at the IPK is climate change. And we're especially interested in cities and climate change and the politics of climate change. And so the program we have for you tonight is very much in our sweet spot, and it's something we've been wanting to do for a long time because we have so many people here who are talking about the Green New Deal and asking questions about what the Green New Deal is and could be, and wonder how they can get involved and maybe be a part of shaping it. And it's really in that spirit that we're all here tonight. So I started talking to friends about what a good Green New Deal panel would look like. And who to invite. And several people said that you can't do a panel on the Green New Deal if you don't invite Rihanna Gunn Wright. So I said,
Definitely can't.
you can't do a good panel if you don't have Rihanna Gunn Wright. So here she is, magically. She's often called the architect of the Green New Deal. I'm betting she would just say she's one of the architects of the Green New Deal, but we can call her the architect. Regardless, she has something to say and has articulated a really powerful kind of principled moral vision of why we need this, because it's the right thing to do for the future of our species and for everyone now. She is not new to talking about policy and politics and doing it seriously. She not long ago was the policy director for Abdul al-Sayed's 2018 gubernatorial campaign in Michigan. She was a policy intern for someone you might know of, First Lady Michelle Obama, and was also a Rhodes Scholar and a policy analyst for the Detroit Health Department and for many other institutes. We're really, really thrilled that you could make it here from DC, so thank you for coming up. Then we're going to bring up an IPK and NYU veteran, Danielle Aldana Cohen, who just a few years ago was writing a dissertation on climate and cities here at IPK and NYU, and is now an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania and also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. So he's overcome his tough times here at NYU to make something of himself. And he is writing these days a book based on his dissertation. He's published articles in journals like Nature and Public Culture and the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. He also contributes occasionally to Dissent and The Nation and The Guardian. And he wanted me to let you know that he is now editing a special series for Jacobin on the Green New Deal. And so they'll be publishing a lot of work. They've already put out some stuff. It's really something to follow, so please do. And then finally, we have Pavlina Chernova, who is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Economics at Bard College and a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute. Pavlina is an expert on the job guarantee and has developed a blueprint for implementation, which is currently informing proposals of several members of Congress. She's now doing research on the impact of direct job creation on growth, income inequality, and unemployment, in particular on women and youth. And she has been advising a number of political officials who are interested in addressing things like inequality and work and climate. You've probably heard of some of them. One's named, she's got these initials, AOC, we've been calling her. You probably know her. And also Pavlina helped to advise Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election. I'm guessing you'll have people's ear in 2020 as well, or at least I hope so. So the format for tonight is we're just going to go down the line at the table. I've asked each panelist to speak for about 15 minutes, more or less. And we want to have lots of time for conversation afterwards. I'll come up and moderate a conversation. The one thing I ask of you is that we have a couple people taping or video recording tonight. And there's some seats up in front. If you're way in the back and you want to hear, there's a few seats up here, just come up. So before you ask your question, wait for the mic to come to you. And the other thing is, because there's a lot of people, I know there's going to be a lot of conversation tonight, please just out of respect for the panelists, ask a question. No one's running for office here tonight, or you shouldn't be, so just if you can ask a question, it'll be great. So let's get going. Rihanna, it's yours first.
Thank you. And it's really an honor to be here. I love talking directly to people about policy. And so Eric asked me to talk in general about what the Green New Deal is, and sort of where it came from. And so I'll try to do that. And so I think what's really important, one of the first places to start with the Green New Deal is that the Green New Deal is a plan to tackle climate change and income inequality at the same time. And so the Green New Deal is not just the resolution, right? The resolution is the first step, as it's a marker, if you will, and what will be a long process to develop legislation and to really turn this idea of a Green New Deal, which is fundamentally, again, an economic mobilization to deal with climate change and inequality at the same time, into something real, right? Something that decides and helps govern the world that we live in. And so I think it's really, people often ask me, why would you lump those two things together, right? They're gigantic. Aren't they easier to deal with separately? And I'm always like, well, one, do you know you're talking to a black person or no? Or, because they're always like, well, why equity? And I'm like, I think it's important. And so that is one part of it, but I also think it depends on how you define easier, right? Easier for whose life actually becomes easier, who's paying for it, what happens in the end. And I say that because I actually think when people are saying, won't it be easier, they're actually saying a number of things that they are not saying in that moment. And usually what they mean is like, won't it be easier to pass under the exact conditions that we have now? Won't it be easier to pass if this party stays the same, if this other party stays the same, if we still have all of the systems in place, won't it be easier to pass? But they don't necessarily say, but won't it also, in it being easier to pass, what I always try to tease out is what you're also saying is that the bargain for it to be easier to pass is that it keeps all of the power relationships the same. That's what will make it easier to pass. And who benefits from those power relationships and who suffers? And are we actually going to be making Americans' lives easier, right? If you separate the two. So I say that to say that the GND represents, I don't think it's necessarily a new approach across the board. Particularly environmental justice groups have been talking about these sort of interconnections for a long time. But the approach that we're taking to climate change is fundamentally an economic mobilization approach, which is based in industrial policy, which says the government should usually work with the private sector, but as actual partners, right? That's also a contentious topic right now, because right now in the model that we have, which is very neoliberal, working with the private sector usually means being the handmaiden for the private sector, right? Corporations get to do whatever, wealth gets to do what it wishes to do, and the private sector or the public sector is supposed to come in, stop market failures, right? And when it can't stop those market failures, bail out. So an economic mobilization approach instead says the government has a space as a real partner in shaping markets and investing in markets and figuring out the economic future of this country. And we have to bring everyone along and actually use all of the resources that we have, both in terms of monetary capital, physical capital, and workers to move forward on an issue, which is a little bit different from the ways that we usually approach climate change, which are a mix of technology will save us and God will fix it. There's not usually a lot of space in between, but those are sort of like the overall approaches. And ours is different. And so people also say, well, if you're putting it together, isn't it a Trojan horse? Isn't it a progressive wish list? Which it's not, but the truth is we chose this approach because it is cross-cutting, right? If you take an economic mobilization approach to dealing with climate change, you're talking about how do I create work? What types of work will I create? Will I be creating jobs through new transmission, creating jobs through upgrading all homes and businesses? I'm moving away from the mic. The mic is not malfunctioning. If you take that approach, you're opening up a lot of space to do those things. And the fact is, some of the things that people have the most issue with, say, a jobs guarantee, we've known that you need a public employment program for a long time to deal with income inequality. The income inequality that we have at this level is too much to redistribute through the tax system, which means you have to get in front of the tax system. But everyone's always said, well, you can't have a public employment program. What work will people do? Won't they just be doing non-productive things? Look at Italy or whatever country people read one headline for and decided it was terrible. And the truth is that maybe that could possibly be the case. But if you take an economic mobilization approach, all of a sudden you have all of this work. Right? You have all this work that needs to be done. You need to mobilize workers. Why not have a jobs guarantee? And that is a cross-cutting approach. But unfortunately, in policy, we usually don't have cross-cutting approaches. You deal with one problem at a time. And so that is one of the interventions that the Green New Deal is making. So it's not a progressive wish list, but it's not a mistake that these things fit together either. Right? So it's neither, deeply maniacal, nor are we Bambi in the woods that had no idea what we were doing, which is another way that people like to portray folks in the GND leading it, particularly because we're young and particularly because we're of color. And that's just the reality of it. And so I think the other real reason I'm talking all about this, because I think the approach actually really matters. And when you see where we're coming from, it makes a lot more sense why it fits together. And so I think the other fundamental thing is that we believe at New Consensus and other proponents of the GND is that decarbonization is fundamentally a transition to a different energy source, which changes everything. And so that is going to necessitate a deep transformation in our political economy, whether it's on purpose or not, right? And we've seen it over and over. The transition from slavery changed our entire political economy. That was an economic transformation. The switch for the Industrial Revolution changed the political economy, right? This is going to happen with decarbonization. When you change the energy that you take in, it's like saying as humans, you don't eat food, right? Fossil fuel is an energy source. Those are energy sources that we use. Food is our energy source. If you were to not eat food anymore, how would your world change? Right? So if we don't use fossil fuels anymore, how will our world change? It means a lot. It has a lot of knock-on effects. So you are going to see not only effects, our world, there's an idea that we can somehow deal with climate change and everything will look the same. It's not true. It's just not true. And so the Green New Deal is about saying that this economic transformation will be coming whether you want it or not. No matter how fast we switch, it's going to happen. And so instead of saying, no, that doesn't exist, we can just deal with the energy sources, we don't have to think about those things, which means that you leave all of those decisions up to the market. You leave those decisions up to the same power brokers that have power right now, right? And we'll use the transformation to have more power. We're saying, how do you interrupt that cycle? How do you interrupt that path and think proactively about the type of political economy that you want, that we want, that serves people? And so that's a recognition. And I think something else that that the Green New Deal is very open about is that policy is not apolitical. Every time you change a policy, you are changing a system. Every time you intervene in a system, there is a chance for not only change, but redress of past injustices. And so, especially now, if you're going to be opening up this huge space, right, and you're not only going to be opening up, you're going to be creating jobs, having these new influxes of capital, why not actually take that seriously? Right? And why not use these opportunities, we're talking about an economy-wide, societal-wide transformation. Why not take all of those openings to figure out how you can redress past injustices, because the fact is, if you don't address them, they will continue to perpetuate, which is part of the reason we have what we have now, both in terms of the climate crisis and in terms of inequality. So now, how do you stop that, and how do you also not perpetuate that in the future? Because any inequity that we cause in this transition, generations will live with. I live every day with the fact that my grandfather was shut out of the GI Bill. Actually, he was Korean War, so they might have fixed it by then, but it's still not great. Or that my family, right, I'm Black, they were down the South, they were agricultural and domestic workers, they were shut out of Social Security for 15 years. That is 15 years of wealth that they did not save. Right? We live with these repercussions for generations. So instead of sowing more inequity into the system, how do we stop, think about what we will create, and try to make it as just as we can? And how do we use these openings that we're creating to redress past injustices? So that is the general framework of the G&D. Right now, there's a resolution that lists the 5 main goals of the Green New Deal, 14 projects, and just overall gives a sense of what the Green New Deal is aiming for and the scale, speed, and scope with which we desire to move. And now we're in the next phase of that. Now that the groundwork has been laid out, we're figuring out, and particularly at New Consensus, our job is to figure out, what does the policy look like? How do we move forward? And also, how do we incorporate the focus on justice and equity in the ways that we do our own research? Because if your methods don't match up with your values, which hopefully should map onto your outcomes, you won't get what you desire to create. And so that's what we're really thinking hard about. And I just like to read, if you haven't read the resolution, I do encourage you to read it. I think it's fire, but other people have other ideas, but I did want to read a couple passages that are my favorite passages. And I bring them up because we talk about the Green New Deal often as a climate policy, which it is, but it's also, again, it's about a transformation of our political economy and being thoughtful and intentional about that. And so these are a couple of sections that stick out to me that I think people miss, other than being very mad at us in op-eds about them. So whereas the federal government led mobilizations during World War II and the New Deal created the greatest middle class that the United States has ever seen, but many members of frontline and vulnerable communities were excluded from many of the economic and societal benefits of those mobilizations. And whereas the House of Representatives recognizes that a new national social, industrial, and economic mobilization on a scale not seen since World War II and the New Deal is a historic opportunity to create millions of good, high-wage jobs in the United States, to provide unprecedented levels of prosperity and economic security for all people of the United States, and to counteract systemic injustices. Which I've never seen systemic injustices in legislation before, so I was really pumped about that. And then I think the last bullet point in the resolution, I think, is just really what the Green New Deal is about. There's a whereas clause, I don't remember it, but the bullet point is providing all people of the United States with high quality health care, affordable, safe, and adequate housing, economic security, and access to clean water, clean air, healthy and affordable food, and nature.
Okay. Thank you all for coming out. Now, thank you for bearing with me. I'm using both of my hands here, which is... okay, so thank you so much for that, Rihanna. Thank you for making this happen, Eric. So what I want to kind of talk about is one idea for the Green New Deal, but I'll say a little bit more about the kind of framing of that. So I'm co-editing a series for Jacobin, and I'd urge you to read all the articles. Obviously, we think they're great. And as Rihanna was saying, our premise is that the Green New Deal is not going to be a bill, but an era. Now, let's just assume it's going to be an era, so what are we going to do? And for me, as a very academically minded person, one way that I think about the kinds of things that Rihanna were just saying is that in the same way that Stuart Hall says that race is the modality through which class is lived, colonialism and racial capitalism are the modalities through which climate change is lived. And really none of these moves without the other, and tackling one involves tackling the other. Another kind of academic premise that I bring is, I think Roberto Unger is a really fascinating Brazilian scholar, and my research, quite a bit of it is in São Paulo, and he has a knack for titles. So false necessity is basically the catchphrase for all of what critical social science is meant to be, which is that we show that arrangements that seem to be necessary are not. And then a quote from a more recent book, we understand a state of affairs by grasping what it can become in a range of circumstances. The understanding of the actual is inseparable from the imagination of the possible, of the adjacent possible. And what I think Unger is getting at is that as a kind of academic method, and he spells this out at some depth, you cannot separate a critique of current institutional kind of arrangements without also proposing alternative institutional arrangements. When you just have critique without proposal, you end up living a kind of fantasy life outside of the world that you think is bad. And so in that realm, this is why I want to kind of put forward a possibility of one of the ways the Green New Deal can work for housing, partly is I think trying to model what does an engaged and critical social science look like in the era of climate change. It involves getting into the kind of nitty gritty of alternative institutional arrangements, or potentially reconstructions or new constructions. Now, the Green New Deal to me has focused on the production aspect, industrial policy, that's fine, and we need to make things and new kinds of things in new ways. And I'm working with Jan actually on trying to figure out what it means to democratize innovation, and he works on lab meat. But I think the other piece of it is, what is the built environment of our consumption? And this is so important because the argument I'm going to make is if you change the built environment in which we live, you create a world in which we can have public no carbon affluence without using resources in the way that the high carbon affluence was based on. And so the point is that if you think of consumption as individual behavior, you have a horrible political problem, and you also don't really understand how things work. But if you understand kind of everyday life and what the sociologist Manuel Castells called collective consumption as being involved in the built environment, you think, how do we use this moment of massive reinvestment and infrastructure in the built environment to create physical landscapes in which we don't depend on the endless production of stuff to be happy and to be prosperous? Right? So the question of decarbonizing in long term, the problem isn't just carbon, but plastics, species extinction, water pollution, and so on. Long term, we need to create a physical landscapes, urban landscapes, rural landscapes, landscapes of leisure, in which what production does is not so intense as what it does now. Okay, so very quickly, I agree that a Green New Deal has to be equitable, but a major reason for that is that when I did my dissertation research in São Paulo and New York, what I found is that the neoliberal environmental climate policies of people like Mike Bloomberg never worked. Partly because they were resisted, because they were thought by many movements of working class people, housing movements, they thought they would create a kind of green gentrification, and those movements were right. But partly because the political basis of the neoliberal climate policies was not willing to discipline itself. So the Real Estate Board of New York told Bloomberg, actually, we can't do building efficiency upgrades that you want us to do. And neither in New York nor São Paulo, or I would argue really anywhere, has the business class really gone to the mat for pro-poor policies that would clearly be beneficial for the climate. Things like bus lanes on every single city street. So the coalition behind the kind of neoliberal, or what I call in the book, luxury ecology policies is never strong enough to get anything through, because that coalition is anchored by financial and commercial interests that are not willing to discipline themselves. They're not willing to take on the market because they are the market. And so I showed that actually housing movements led largely by women of color in both cities are actually low carbon protagonists. And this is important in New York City on Thursday. Pete Sikora from New York Communities for Change asked me to point out, so there's going to be a vote on the most aggressive building energy bill that has ever been seen in a city in the US on Thursday at City Hall. And if you go to actually the Facebook page of New York Communities for Change, you can get details. And New York is going to get congestion pricing, and it's going to get major building energy upgrades that don't cause rents to go up and that build local jobs because the housing movement has come on board with new versions of building energy upgrades and new versions of congestion pricing. So the big difference that you're going to see, 12 years, a kind of reset from Earth Day 2007 when Plan OIC starts to Earth Day, this coming Monday, the Green New Deal for New York. The big difference is housing movements switch sides and the policies change to reflect that. So it's all about the coalitional politics. Okay, very briefly, I do a lot of carbon footprint analysis. We're also doing a lot of work on the built environment of the Green New Deal at Penn. We're doing this thing now called whole community climate mapping. And I'll just give you the punchline, which is that contra the idea that densification always yields lower carbon emissions in cities, it's just not true. The most affluent people who live in Manhattan, consume the most, fly the most, have huge carbon footprints. The vision of decarbonizing cities by yoking climate politics to the lifestyle and economic preferences of high-consuming professionals just doesn't work. And in fact, it turns out that the real low-carbon neighborhoods are neighborhoods where working-class groups, unions, racial justice groups, other community groups have built the kind of physical and social infrastructure that Eric talks about that's an urban fabric of kind of democratic, low-carbon public affluence, things like basketball courts, rather than the kind of urbanization that you see now, which is basically bringing McMansions and those malls into luxury developments downtown. And you can go to Hudson Yards and see how great that density is for the environment. And just very briefly, before I move to the Green New Deal for housing point, part of what we're trying to do now with this mapping is to be able to fine-tune in a way no one has by going down to the neighborhood level with big data techniques, but shaped by social science concerns, use predictive spatial statistics to figure out what are actually the neighborhoods that have the fuel poverty. Which are the specific neighborhoods where you have what I call compound exposure to both high energy prices and toxic harms, right? So how can we direct policies in the most efficient way? Because one of the big hallmarks of the new kind of climate justice politics is targeted investments in communities that need it the most. And once we fine tune that, we want to have tools that allow us to hit our priorities right away. Now, data does not solve the problem of politics, but better data can help politics. And it's better, I would argue, for critical social scientists to be making that data than Google. Okay, so I want to kind of exemplify some of the claims I've made by talking about what a Green New Deal for housing would be like. Now, I think this idea is basically implicit in the resolution, but some aspects I want to push. One dimension of it is, of course, upgrading existing homes, and there's a lot we could say about that. But what I'm pushing at Jacobin and picking up on work from the People's Policy Project is the idea of a massive reinvestment in public housing, such as not been seen in the United States for a very long time. So very quickly, now one could obviously haggle on the numbers here, 10 million public no-carbon homes in 10 years. Highest design standards, diversity of governance, cities, towns, suburbs. People think the housing crisis is cities only, but it's not true. It's all over rural America as well. I'll give you some very quick reasons why this is important, and then I'm going to say a little bit about Vienna to kind of exemplify what I think a New Deal era reimagining of the built environment looks like. First, housing inequality is just as important to the racial wealth gap and to other forms of inequality as underemployment. In fact, arguably more important. For one thing, wages have stagnated, but housing costs have massively increased. Housing costs have increased by 50% in cities. So I think there's a strong argument that actually the pinch of kind of class inequality is felt in housing now as much or more than it is in wages. And second, this is the great failure of the New Deal. And it's not just the failure of government action, but it's the failure of a public-private partnership between the government and the real estate industry that first excluded African-American families from homeownership and then created multiple forms of predatory finance such that access to homeownership ended up being a trap. So that you have a racial wealth gap with, in the order of $100,000, the average wealth of white families to practically zero for Black and Latino families. So again, homeownership as becoming the engine of inequality. And as Kianga Yamada-Taylor has been showing in her book is about to come out, it is the public-private partnership with real estate so that mortgage assistance, as we have known it, has never been the solution, but in fact exacerbated the problem of housing, racialized housing inequality. Beyond that, it's not just about who has access to homes. There's the question of rentership, and half of renters pay over a third of their income in rent, and a quarter of renters pay over half of their income in rent, and it's worse if you look at Black and Latino families. But there's also the problem of energy insecurity, the guts of buildings. In the Mid-Atlantic, half of Black households cannot afford their utility bills. Now, we only know in the Mid-Atlantic, and this is part of why I want to do the data to kind of zoom in. But when we think about upgrade, the whole nature of the built environment is kind of saturated with these forms of racial inequality. And I'm arguing that you need a massive push of federal public investment if you actually want to address this problem. Now, very quickly, there is going to be a need for a huge amount of housing. Just sea level rise alone will displace 12 to 13 million Americans by 2100, just sea level rise alone. We're not talking about drought, heat. We can talk about places like the Midwest that are flooding. So we don't have any projections to give us a reliable number, but we're talking millions and millions and millions and millions, and people are not up for managed retreat when they have nowhere to go. We have to decarbonize the building sector, which consumes 40% of US energy. And for this, public procurement, I'm arguing, is a huge role to play in creating the jobs and the technologies to deal with this. And I'll skip through this, but I think there's also an argument to be made in this Green New Deal era that if we don't actually tie social policy to climate change, it may well disappear. So public housing in California is now done exclusively through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And I think that's likely to happen. And for the housing community, it's absolutely essential to get inside of the Green New Deal policymaking apparatus, because on the outside, it's likely that nothing is going to happen. And finally, I'm not going to really dive into this, but essentially, the current form of densification, although ostensibly low carbon, when you do the full carbon footprint, is not. And you only actually can have low carbon density if you also have non-market housing. And I just did a paper in an urban journal on Seattle and Amazon and how the form of gentrification that has caused is displacing tons of people and probably leaving or even raising carbon footprints in the areas where they are ostensibly creating new climate-friendly lifestyles. Okay, so this is a great idea, so many reasons. There's the question of how. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but to say, apologies, I've got so many lists here. I always say that the smartest people have the shortest list, but I'm talking about myself, unfortunately. So we'll talk for a second about Vienna. We get into details, but essentially New Jersey turns out to actually have the best policies thanks to mobilization starting in the 1970s to ensure that public housing and affordable housing is in every single community, so we need to learn from New Jersey. And California has really fantastic policies in terms of locating housing where it needs to go. So there are actually precedents here. So this is not all whole cloth or all imported from Europe like shoes or something. Okay, so the Vienna precedent. The Vienna precedent has inspired this new idea about social housing in the US. And very quickly, the thing about Vienna is this. Starting in 1919, you have this thing called Red Vienna. After the First World War, taxing is given to Vienna, has its own taxing powers. And the legacy of Red Vienna, which essentially is ongoing, is that in Vienna, 1/3 of the housing is market. 1/3 is public, 1/3 is cooperative. Carbon emissions are through the floor, because this is also beautiful public transit, which, by the way, costs €1 a day. And people complain when the bus takes 7 minutes to show up. This is what public housing looks like in Vienna. This is what public housing looks like in Vienna. This is what a cooperative housing development looks like in Vienna. So an extremely high quality design, mixed income housing, but at such scale that the mixed income is not a way to push poor people out. It simply means that there is an entire tranche of the market, literally 1/3 of the market, which is just a bit cheaper and still very beautifully designed. That's the public. Another tranche that's a little more expensive if you want to pay a bit more for your room. That's the co-op. And there are mechanisms to ensure that anybody can get into both the co-op housing and the public housing. Now, here I am doing field work. Yeah. Not even a selfie. See, I have friends. In front of Karl Marxhof, which is the kind of iconic building in Vienna. In Vienna, Karl Marxhof, 1,200 units, libraries, dental clinics, all this stuff kind of built in. 18% lot coverage. If you're a housing nerd, you know that means there's a ton of green space. And I don't want to counteract what Pavlina's going to say, but in Vienna, they did pay for it with taxes. 1/3 of the public housing was funded with luxury taxes. Posters from the era. They taxed champagne. They taxed only from the second servant. The first was not considered a luxury. They taxed racehorses. And they made a very clear equation. Like, what does it mean to tax the rich, and who is going to benefit from that? Now, it may seem, we talk about California and Jersey, blah, blah. And even actually even the Center for American Progress is now talking about public housing. I don't know if you saw in the news today, Bernie Sanders is attacking them. Center for American Progress, Clintonite arm, is saying 1 million units in 5 years. So if you're planning less public housing than the Center for American Progress, I'm not sure that you have a fully transformative vision. But again, we're fleshing out the Green New Deal here, right? Now, okay, this is Vienna, but actually there's a tie-in to the United States. This is a building in the Lower East Side. It's called the Amalgamated Dwellings. It was a cooperative built for Jewish and Italian workers, essentially a socialist union, built in 1931. And the architect's name was Roland Wonk. He was a Hungarian immigrant who came to the US because he was fed up with living in Europe, as one becomes. And he had spent some time in Vienna. And he built this building as an homage to the Karl Marx Hof, right? It looks familiar for a reason. And he was a specialist in public housing. This is a beautiful building, beautiful space. It too has a community space inside of it. It has a little stage. People put on plays. It's really the heyday of kind of socialist New York. Most of the stuff was built in the Bronx. This is in the Lower East Side. And I visited it recently. It's quite gorgeous. And so Wonk had this amazing thing happen. He built this building. Then he went to Cincinnati, built the train station. And he got hired by the Tennessee Valley Authority to build workers' housing. And he went to Norris to build the dam. And he got there. And they showed him a picture of the dam. And he said, this is ugly. And so not only did he build the workers' housing in Norris, which had the first green belt of any city in the United States, but he rebuilt the dam. He designed it, and he said, listen, we have to show people that public infrastructure is for them. He built viewing platforms so people could see the dams. He sculpted approach roads. As his eulogist put it, when you would come around the mountain and see the dam, it was like seeing the Acropolis coming up after a bunch of pine trees. And so Wonk actually played a huge role in bringing public power to rural United States, kind of connecting the housing issue and the energy issue. And with this idea of public infrastructure for the public good, always this notion that what we as designers are doing is building the environment for the people. Now, the best of Wonk is here, and I'll say more about him in just 1 second, but it's important to remember the New Deal did not just reproduce Jim Crow, but in many ways it hardened Jim Crow. So I think it's important to remember the Green New Deal is not about that. These are the faces of decarbonization. Rachel Rivera, who's the most important maybe housing activist in New York Communities for Change, who's doing the stuff I told you. Ivanichi Araujo, who's helped to kind of bring public housing to downtown Sao Paulo. And near the end of his time, Wonk wrote this fantastic essay, Nowhere to Go But Forward, where he talks about this is 1941, the Nazis are invading Europe. There's a sense that no one knows what's going to happen. And Wonk says, we have to reimagine the profession of architecture, not as this exotic thing, but as simply making the world, just like anybody else. And I think that the title of this essay, and I'm not going to read to you from it because I'm short, the title of this essay to me is just the ultimate rebuke to everybody who says to AOC or to anybody else, you're rushing this, we don't have the data yet, blah, 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 blah. The fact is we know what the problem is, we know how big it is, we don't know what all the answers are, but we know the way to getting them is simply to struggle and to build and to work. And so I think the answer to all of our critics is always going to be nowhere to go but forward. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a bit of a tall task because I think I was given two talk titles. So I'll try to combine them into one. I really wanted to basically tie in some themes from the first two talks. The first one is on how we are looking at a panoply of policies that fit within the Green New Deal and talk a little bit about the macroeconomics of that vision, a Green New Deal that is married to a series of social and economic policies and why that's important. And the second task is how to pay for it. The perennial question that is always raised when we are asked whether we can afford a good future. And I think the answer actually lies right there in the answer. But the first thing I want to say is that the Green New Deal is talked about as if it is this enormously daunting task. And the answer to this is that it's not, because we've done it before. If you look at the world, if you look at the economy prior to the 30s, it looked extremely differently from the way it looks today. There are so many things that we take for granted today that were won over at the span of 2 short years, from 40-hour work week to minimum wage, to the ability to negotiate with your employer, to having Social Security that we take for granted, to the whole host of public policies that we put in place. We truly transformed the economy overnight. And those were bold, big transformations, but they did leave a lot of people behind. And so the second point to make is that any economic policy is social policy. And it is a jobs policy, whether we acknowledge those aspects or not. And so we might as well just bring them very explicitly to the forefront and say, Green New Deal is a jobs policy. It is a social policy. What would we like the world to look like? And so I specifically look at the jobs guarantee is what I'm looking at, but specifically looking at the labor market issues. And the reason why they're important is because to fix the environment, it takes work. And what kind of work is it going to be? Is it going to be the same punitive, onerous, awful kind of work that so many of us experience? Who are we saving the environment for? Right? Are we saving the environment? What is the philosophical premise behind saving the environment, but allowing households to toil away, juggling multiple jobs, not being able to get health insurance, struggling with bills? Is this the green future we envision? Why don't we address the neglect that people experience in their lives, the pain and the distress that they experience from economic insecurity? So it's not just clean water, it is also the ability to have stable income, decent income, to be able to provide for oneself even after we've cleaned up the environment. And then the other issue is, well, let's just fix the jobs program and problem, and let's give people good incomes and, the means to support themselves, but still, drink poisoned water and, breathe toxic air. So these two things are completely organically connected. They just cannot be separated. And so when I think about work and about specifically the job guarantee as part and parcel of the Green New Deal, I think about the following issues. The Atlantic, I think, called it the most crucial component of the Green New Deal. But I think the other policies are just as important. And so whether you're able to transition to a just future, you need to deal with the issue of access to healthcare, access to housing, access to decent food, and in some ways, access to good retirement, right? In some ways, some of these tasks are not as difficult because we already have Social Security. Strengthening it is just one step further, right? We already have infrastructure in place. We already have Medicare. Like adding a few, it's like 70 million people, right? Adding 10 more, it's just think of the magnitude of the things that we've already accomplished and what we need to do just to walk the extra step. With jobs, it's a little different. It's a little different because the premise of the job guarantee is that we need to guarantee the right to decent work to anyone and everyone, and when they need it, irrespective of the condition of the economy or irrespective of the personal circumstance of the person. Rain or shine, there will be people who need work and need decent, stable work. And the right to work is a basic human right that is in countless of constitutions. It is in the Universal Declaration. It's a mandate that we have not yet met. And there is a long list of why this is an important right that we need to secure. I'm going to just focus on two. The first one is that we are kind of accustomed to this, I can call it like economics of neglect, to this idea that somehow it is okay to have people to struggle and not be able to get like income or not get jobs. That somehow this is a natural outcome of a market phenomena. That the environmental degradation is the unfortunate circumstance of a market mechanism. And the job guarantee and the New Deal basically refuse to accept this unfortunate but really unavoidable outcome of the market process. And they say, no, the market process is structured, we can structure it differently. If we were to go through the social costs of unemployment and unstable employment, they are staggering. They're staggering. I just read a research on young people who are experiencing increase in mortality because of unstable income, not just unemployment. The research on unemployment is quite phenomenal. Like people from a spell of unemployment, they have a permanent impact on their mortality. They have permanent impact. They have a permanent impact on wages, which we know, scarring effects, etc. They have a lot more challenges in the labor market if they experience unemployment. But those costs are not limited to them only. They're also extended to their children, to their spouses. The literature is very good. It's just economists don't pay attention to these costs. It is a very expensive proposition to run an economy that tolerates a lot of unemployment or precarious employment. And you can make the same argument for other policies, subsidizing fossil fuels. It's a very expensive policy because that is tied to so many of our health problems. When you look at the social determinants of health, when you look at the food production system, I mean, everything is connected to everything. We live in an extremely toxic and expensive paradigm of neglect. And we just have to, flip the script and say, here's how we move forward. By nurturing our communities, nurturing the environment, taking care of people. So number one is the social cost of unemployment, precarious employment, lack of access to good food, healthcare, etc. The second thing I want you to think about, and this is just what's sort of near and dear to my heart professionally, is that unemployment has this really bizarre way in which it behaves. Now people are saying we're at full employment, don't worry about it, the economy is strong. But in the United States, the way unemployment behaves, it's like a yo-yo. It just shoots up when there's a little bit of a downturn. It doesn't even have to be a great recession. It shoots up when there's a little bit of a downturn, and then very slowly it recovers in an expansion. And so economists really personify how we talk about unemployment. We say, the unemployment rate. Like, what is the unemployment rate? It is millions of people. Very specifically, it's millions of people who have been laid off en masse. And it's their families as well. But the natural unemployment rate is about 4 million people. What does that mean? So it's naturally okay to have about 4 million people in destitution and not able to make ends meet. And so the only time we personify unemployment is when we try to blame the unemployed for their lot and say, you haven't pulled yourself by your bootstraps and you haven't done the right investments and training and, it's a moral failing. And so the job guarantee just rejects this entire narrative and says, well, okay, fine, maybe there is even a personal problem out there. Does that mean that somebody should not be guaranteed a chance to work when the economy is structured in a way to always have some level of unemployment? And when even policy and politics are targeting some sort of positive unemployment rate. And this is, economists know this, but if you follow how, the Fed officials talk about unemployment, they're looking for the magical number of the number of unemployed people. One that doesn't mean a too hot an economy or too cold an economy. And that is a morally bankrupt paradigm, morally unacceptable, because we simply have the means to employ the unemployed and to put them, to give them opportunities to work in public service projects that have been neglected for decades. We have twin problems of neglect of the environment and communities and neglect of people, and we've got to marry the two together. And so I can go on and on to talk about all of these aspects, but it is very important that we understand the macroeconomics of the Green New Deal involves the following things. One is a transformation of industrial transformation. The right questions to ask there are what is the technological know-how and the technological prerequisites to transition to a green future? Who is going to bear the brunt of that transition? Who's going to lose their job? What are we going to do with the people who cling on to, they are very important but fossil fuel jobs, right? And so how do we transition so that people we can minimize disruptions for people first, and then we mobilize that labor to actually address the very climate issues that we are trying to tackle. Some of these climate issues will be big industrial policies, right? Changing the energy grid. But there are very small projects in the communities. Like somebody's got to go and test the lead pipes. We just need an army of people. Somebody's got to go and clean up the park or get rid of all the abandoned lots. Monitor the species in the river. Like these things are invisible, but they're extremely important. And they don't represent, necessarily industrial strategy, but they could be a really good employment strategy. And the multiplier effects are all there. And how much time do I have? I have a couple minutes, 5 minutes? Okay. All right. So the technological aspects of the transition are really the first things that we need to be looking at, and the social aspects. And so we like to say, I forget whose quote this is, but whatever is technologically whatever is technologically feasible is financially possible. Okay. We can financially afford the transition. This is not an obstacle to moving forward with a bold agenda of a green transformation. And so let me just spend 3-4 minutes to talk a little bit about how to pay for, and just give you just ways of thinking about pay-fors. The very first one that I would say is that always think about the real costs first. Because what we are doing now is we're essentially bankrupting an environment and human livelihoods, but we are obsessed with bankrupting the budget, the government budget. These two things are not the same, right? The caps will melt. And they won't come back. But the government budget could be in the deficit. The sky is going to fall, and it's fine, right? We can destroy permanently our natural resources. We can regenerate them, and we need to be working towards this. But these are the things that we need to be thinking about, the real cost. So always keep that in mind first. Second, whenever you're confronted with the idea that we cannot pay for a policy, just say no. Just refuse to accept that narrative. Let me give you a couple of pointers. I'm going to date myself, but I think there are enough people in the audience who remember the Clinton tax cut, right? Okay, and so we got a check in the mail. You remember? For me, it was great. I was right out of college. I put a check in the mail, and I never worried that this check was going to bounce, right? It never occurred to me. And and when we talk about public policies, there is a huge dichotomy. There is a narrative out there about how the government is going broke and is irresponsible, etc. And then there's the practical reality of the government actually spending. And so whoever is getting a check from the public sector, whether it's Social Security, whether it is a housing check, whether it is you're a contractor, you work for the government, you never worry that this check is going to bounce. Now, if you get checks from me, you might worry. You might look at me and say, am I responsible? Do I have a lot of credit card bills? That risk makes sense, but not from the public sector, not from the government sector. And so the one thing I want to say is that we have created a monetary system. We have designed institutions called Treasury and Federal Reserve for one reason alone: to ensure that all public sector payments are made and no checks bounce, period. That's why we have these two institutions. This is what we call monetary sovereignty. So when we think about government spending today, we look at a deficit and we kind of equate it to a household deficit. And they're fundamentally different things. The federal government has these institutions that ensure that all payments are made and no checks bounce because it has monetary sovereignty. In other words, we have a system where money is a public good. The currency is a public monopoly. That's the practical reality of our world. And we really need to stop ourselves and stop thinking that we can possibly run out of green pieces of paper. This is not the problem that we face. Okay. The second thing that I want to say is that we instinctively know this, even though the narrative and ideology out there is so powerful that government is going broke and it has to balance its books like households. The narrative is so powerful, but on our gut level, we know that's not true because we see it all the time. We see when a $1 trillion tax cut is being passed overnight, and we didn't find the money to pay for it. We fight trillion-dollar wars, and nobody asks a question like whose taxes paid for this, right? We overnight rescued the financial sector. It took a week. It could have taken a day if Congress didn't, exactly. But it took a week to pass a $700 billion package to rescue the financial sector, and that was just the beginning. Trillions more followed. Nobody asked, how are you going to pay for it? The way you pay for it is the Treasury and the Fed get together and they clear the checks. That's it. The way we pay for programs is the government passes a budget and says this is a policy priority, this is what we value, and the payments come. We just have not done the same for the Green New Deal. We haven't done the same for jobs. And so what I am suggesting is not that we need to reinvent the wheel. We have the tool. We have a monetary system that allows us to meet our policy priorities. And the questions we need to ask is how to pay for. How? How can we pay for these policies to make sure that we have a good economy that doesn't cause additional disruptions? Maybe inflation, maybe inequality, right? The way we spend today, there are no limits, but we know exactly where the dollars are going, right? If the government spends more into the economy than it takes away, some of these dollars end up in somebody's pocket. Is it yours? Right? We know how those assets are allocated. And so we are also talking about using the budget to rebalance that process as well. And so I'm just going to conclude again by restating that let's first and foremost think about the real cost of the existing problems and designing policies to address them. And second, that we need to just employ the public's money for the public good. That's why it was created. And the pressing tasks before us are climate change and economic insecurity. Thank you.
Terrific. I'm just going to ask one other question, not to you, but to put out there, which is, how do we get by if we don't do this?
You don't.
Well, I mean...
You want to say more?
Well, like, what do you mean? I mean, the climate crisis is here, right? Like, if we stay on the trajectory that we're on, and I mean, the estimations are between 3 and 6 degrees of warming. At 2 degrees of warming, sub-Saharan Africa becomes uninhabitable. Like, you might not be able to grow food there. Sea level rise. So, like, the idea that there is an alternative to dealing with the climate crisis is a joke.
So I guess the point I'm trying to make is we spend a lot of time asking, how we're going to pay for it, but we don't spend enough time saying, well, how do we survive if we don't pay for it? Because that's a really difficult question. You don't have to. I just wanted to throw that.
The corollary to this is that we will be paying for it in financial terms because there are fires that incinerate cities, and there are floods, and there are hurricanes, and we will have to address the fallout. You can't just not spend, and it's again far more expensive proposition in terms of real and financial resources to do that than to actually do remedial work and all of the other stuff.
Yeah, and that's public spending, period. Whereas like a lot of the policies you could be thinking about public-private, you can be thinking about how do you take in private capital. There's lots of things, but when you're talking about disaster remediation, that is fully public money. No, yeah.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions, and I'm just going to ask you one more time. Please wait for the mic and try to be as succinct as you can be. So there's a question right here. Yeah, go ahead.
Several times in the presentations, you've mentioned food, and as a basic good and fundamental human need, food and water, and it's not fully articulated yet in the resolution exactly how we get there, and I'd love to hear a vision of what the elements of that would be that people can foresee.
Hi, I just want to ask Pavlina to pick up a little bit on what she just said about how the real and financial costs are so much higher responding, because in other places I've seen you talk about unemployment as an epidemic and responding to it as an epidemic, and the sort of metaphor of prevention before treating ex post as something that suffuses all the kind of policies that we're talking about, as not just that we can't afford it now, but that the costs are the comparison of the costs are incredibly different.
Okay, so why don't you take on those two?
Yeah. Okay, I can start. Actually, let me connect the two. I encourage everyone to go on YouTube and write map of unemployment and just spend a couple of minutes watching the map of unemployment in the United States and watch how it moves and how it behaves. There are communities in distress that are in distress all the time. All the time. You just watch it and you think that the national number tells you some information. It doesn't. And so when you see how an onset of unemployment happens and how it spreads and literally infects the geographical area, like a lot of people get thrown out of work because there is, mass unemployment, mass layoffs in a particular place. So it really truly behaves like a virus. It spreads, and with it spread all of these other social costs, health costs, and all of this other devastation that communities experience. And so these are silent afflictions that you could say, but they're ever present, and they're quite devastating. At the same time, we have countless communities throughout the United States that don't have access to decent, affordable, healthy food. It's called the food desert problem, as I'm sure you well know. And so usually places that have mass unemployment have multiple deprivations. And so what we're trying to do is essentially address all of these with the resources that we have. The industrial process of farming is highly expensive and not particularly healthy. The community garden model is actually a low-cost, low-carbon footprint model with positive health effects.
Yeah, so I'll say for the food systems, all of the policy, like specific policy proposals to flesh out the projects that are in the Green New Deal are still in the works. But regenerative agriculture is something that comes up a lot. And it's actually difficult for me to answer the food question because so much starts with just how do we grow our food, right? How do we switch from industrial farming practices? What does it look like when we are not heavily subsidizing certain crops anymore, right? All of these things make sense, and then after you deal with those, and that's a lot of work. That's talking about how do you retrain farmers, how do you realign incentive structures, how do you then you get to the actual food systems. How do you move to local food systems? We know that those aren't just good for health, but they're a huge economic boon, right? How do you actually structure that? Because our infrastructure is not actually built for that anymore. We know how to do that in very specific ways based on farmers markets, but expanding that out to how do you actually do this and how do you make that the default is a big question. So those are all things that we're thinking about.
Just a sort of a brief provocation on food. The piece by Raj Patel and Jim Goodman on Jacobin is actually an incredible piece. It's like a 5,000-word discussion of class struggle and agricultural politics from the New Deal to the present. I think the core point they kind of end with is actually food is too cheap.
Yes.
The costs of cheap food are borne by human beings in many ways, malnutrition, unemployment in other parts of the world, and of course, the ecosystem, which ultimately is going to hurt us. The point is this: to avoid a battle between the country and the city, quote unquote, high food prices and inadequate ability to afford it is to raise wages. Food needs to be more expensive, wages need to be higher, social services need to be free. We have to create the conditions under which a healthy food system, which would require a lot of human labor to make good, healthy food, is affordable to everybody. And this is, I think, one of the many, many reasons why the Green New Deal's intersectionality is so important. If you don't raise the floor substantially of everybody, then you can't actually make no carbon affluence affordable. And if you want to transform this food system, you have to accept it's going to cost more. That means you have to dramatically raise the floor of wealth and wages in this country.
Okay, so we have a couple of hands. Sir, in the second row.
I think that the issue that we haven't heard much about is what we're going to do with the people who have vested interests in the current system. The politics of conservatives over the last 40 years has changed the way in which business is done, that it's going to take a while to undo it. The people who are in power, the income inequality, these things are preventing a lot of the policies that we've been talking about from being implemented. My question is, outside of electoral politics, and I think 2018 was a good model, What are the ways in which the Green New Deal anticipates dealing with the power structures in the 7 or 8 major areas where climate change is most problematic?
Great, thanks for that. There's a question towards the back.
Yes, hi, I'm a volunteer with Sunrise Movement, obviously very excited about the Green New Deal. My question is, say the Green New Deal resolution passes, is there a wisdom or a strategy around like which pillar of the Green New Deal to go about tackling first?
Okay, and then Soraya, all the way in the back, there's one more hand.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about institutional capacities. I was talking to someone recently who was trying to start a jobs program, was talking to the White House after the Great Recession, and they had to go back and interview people who had tried to start CETA or had worked with CETA in the 80s, and just like had found that the institutional capacity to do like put even a few 100,000 people to work had just like whittled away. So, you know, how do we like do this at the tail end of 40 years of neoliberalism kind of attacking the public sphere?
Okay, so why don't we just go in reverse order from last time?
So that last piece, that's something that I think about a lot, because one of the things that we, that's pretty apparent, but people don't think about a lot, is that neoliberalism not only starved people of wages, it starved the government, right? Especially at state and local levels of revenue. And it also has like really seen whittling down of our bureaucratic apparatus at the federal level, which, people have very complicated feelings about bureaucracy, but if the state is going to be a place for innovation, the bureaucracies have to function well. And so I think one of the first places to start is, one, adequately funding agencies, including their staffing. There's so much focus often. We treat agencies as nonprofits, which means we're always like very low overhead, but do a lot of stuff, which is a terrible model. And so it involves obviously funding staffing and also making it known that the state is a place for innovation. It's not necessarily, you can go there and start new projects and think big thoughts, right? And work on big things. Is not necessarily the place you go just to have a comfortable career for 30 years. And, and that's not, I love public servants. Don't take that the wrong way, Twitter. So I think that's really important. And then I think, I forget the second question, but I remember the first question about what do you do about vested interest, and it's something that we think about a lot. And so honestly, a lot of what we think about is not just the projects in the resolution, but also what are the ways that our regulatory structures from agency to courts play a role. And so how do you, for instance, allow these suits that state AGs are bringing and kids are bringing against fossil fuel companies, right? A lot of those suits have been kicked out because they say it's the jurisdiction of the EPA. That's a legislative fix. If you fix that, what happens, right? And all of a sudden you've opened up a new flank. Now I just told everyone my strategy. Don't watch ExxonMobil. And so, but that's one way, but corporate power is a real thing that you have to contend with. And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, which is that the more corporate power, the more they donate, the more power they have, the more politicians feel like they have to serve them, et cetera, et cetera. And so really thinking hard about how do you deal with corporate power? What does it mean? Even antitrust in the situations that we're in the era that we're in. And so we think about a lot of that. In the absence of those, or until that happens, I think electoral politics is a big space, but not just in election years, but to put constant pressure and to recolor these issues as different politically, right? Like right now, the climate crisis is a blue issue. Blue, blue, blue. If you're red, you don't have to think about it. Well, Nebraska just was underwater, right? And so weather patterns will change, but also just really, I think, there is a lot of power in people, and that's what we need right now too. So also getting into rural communities, a lot of whom are really affected by the climate crisis, are very dependent on the land and environmental cycles, right? And really raising up those stories and connecting them so that it becomes less of just a blue issue that. And that's obviously not just decided by people. Donors also decide what is a blue issue and not, and they have a vested interest. But it becomes a lot more difficult when the base is talking, right, about these issues themselves.
So you want to add?
Yeah, just a couple of quick things. I mean, I think the first is there is a question: why has the fossil fuel industry been allowed to stay in the Business Roundtable, Chamber of Commerce, and so on? I mean, and the answer, whatever that is not that, eventually the corporations will kick out their most polluting members. So it seems to me, I mean, Kate Aronoff is an audience and asked the question, has argued that Rex Tillerson should be tried at The Hague for crimes against humanity. And I think that naming the gravity of the genocidal futures that the fossil fuel companies are creating, and the kinds of populist anger that could generate, I think it has to be on the table. There can't be a situation in which the fossil fuel industries can do business as usual, and that we have progressive politics. I mean, it's just incompatible. So I think we're looking in the years ahead at a very, very massive fight. And I think all of us who care about climate change have to really understand who we're fighting against and not to mince words. That's not enough, but I think it's part of it. And the divestment movement is far more successful than people thought it was, precisely because it is combining the storytelling and the material piece. Just quickly on capacity, I mean, I think I have two concerns about the question of big spending and the Green New Deal. One is that shovel-ready projects. Blue states have been self-funding versions of Green New Deals. That means that if the taps turn on federally, there are projects to fund. But states like Pennsylvania, where I live, cannot afford to self-fund a Green New Deal, and they don't have shovel-ready projects. And we know from the Obama stimulus that if you just say to Goldman Sachs, find something to fund, or if you just cast around for the PDFs that are there, you're not going to find great projects. So I think there is a really big institutional problem there. The second issue I see is the energy system. I think we talk too much about making wind and solar. That is actually really easy to do. The challenge is that we have to switch from a system where supply is dispatched by turning knobs and fossil plants to meet demand, to essentially adjusting demand to meet variable power when it is produced, wind and solar and wind. And batteries can't make a huge difference. And that essentially means that what they call ancillary grid services are everything. Like the ways in which homes and buildings are plugged into the power system, and the way that demand is kind of parceled throughout the day through intelligent systems that seem like Big Brother and kind of are. That is a huge transformation in the institutional organization of the energy system. There's no blueprint for that. There are a bunch of people at places like MIT throwing out PowerPoints and PDFs. But I think that if we think about priorities, it seems to me important to sort of think there are going to have to be teams coming up with ways to figure out how to solve problems that don't depend on finding what's already there and plugging more in. Public recreation isn't really well funded right now, but we know what that looks like. There are core elements of the energy system that we're talking about wrong. It's not about creating clean energy. It's about the kind of social relationship and the physical relationship of energy circulation that is the big thing. And I almost exclusively hear about that from neoliberal energy wonks, and I think that concerns me. Although you and David Roberts are in touch, so that makes me feel better about it.
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a couple of quick things on institutional capacity. I think, part of the problem is that we have had the 40 years of neoliberal thinking, and we need to recapture the conversation. We need to, start thinking about the state in a different way. But then the other thing is that once you make a commitment to a policy, you'd be surprised how quickly people find ways to do things. And so maybe the states, red states, do not have shovel-ready jobs, but it's not like there's not work to be done there and that people can't propose their own projects. And so you can have a more decentralized model of doing these things, either through bottom-up, through cooperatives and municipalist movements, solidarity groups that would, figure out. They are already trying to address some of these social deprivations on the ground. And it's if their efforts are scaled up and they have a method by which they can apply for funds, they can get an approval process for the work that they're doing, we can kind of fix some of this institutional capacity hole, at least in the interim.
Okay. A couple more questions. Malcolm?
Hi, Rihanna. You mentioned at the very beginning that climate and inequality are difficult to couple as a policy because of the way that the parties currently are and the way power arrangements currently are. What does the landscape where a Green New Deal passes looks like in terms of the parties and mobilization? And has that ever happened before in the United States, and what can we learn from the past?
I thought I saw another hand before. Is there a hand back there? You want to ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
My question is a little bit more about the fossil fuel industry, specifically about the Green New Deal's approach to them and how it plans to like co-opt not only that work, but like this system of energy that's been like in use for like since the Industrial Revolution. Like, I mean, they're putting in a new fossil fuel line on my street from like Texas. And that's been like months in the planning, and it's going to be pointless in like 10 years. So like stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. So the first was, given the landscape, how would it need to change? So I meant that policy is siloed in the ways that you're talking about, but also literally in the ways that government works. I was talking to someone who was an Obama administration alum, and this was not just the Obama administration that did this, but he was like, I was at the Department of Labor working on a green jobs program. Then I left and went to the Department of Energy, and we were working on a green jobs program. I never spoke to my colleagues at the Department of Labor. We went out for beers. I still saw them. We just didn't talk. Cross-agency collaboration is way more difficult than it needs to be. And so if you are siloing institutions, right, if you're siloing people, of course you're going to silo information. And of course, all of the incentives will be aligned for people to deal with problems as individual problems and not in cross-cutting solutions or in ways that are cross-cutting. So I actually think one of the most fundamental changes that the Green New Deal will have to make, and one of the ones that's like quieter but could be incredibly difficult, I should say, is actually allowing for interagency collaboration, building that proactively, figuring out how do you fund, right, work that could be managed or overseen by multiple agencies. And also something that Daniel mentioned, how do you help states plan with the full support of the federal government? We have sort of the ways that we do. We have something called formula grants, right, which you get a certain amount of money for a program. And then you have competitive grants like Race for the Top. One of the great things about competitive grants is that people actually have to come up with a proposal, like a plan for what they're going to do. And so Race for the Top had many flaws, but one of them was that it actually did spur states to think really deeply about the goals that were put forward and how they're going to do them. Of course, it left laggard states behind. So one way something that I think about a lot is like, can you combine that so that states are actually planning across the Green New Deal with the full support of the federal government, knowing that funding will come for whatever they come up with, right? And so these are small tweaks, but these are really important in order for the actual work to get done. And now as far as political parties and alignment, I actually think that when I think about what's hardest, I know that that's really hard, but I also feel like that's among the easiest things to solve because bureaucracies, agencies, those processes are deeply internal and very insulated. Politicians are among the most permeable members of society. Their jobs depend on public support. They don't, obviously there's a huge split in what people want and what politicians want and what politicians say people want. But the fact is that pressure in a district or whatever makes people move still, right? And so I actually think the parties could stay the same, but if something becomes enough of a fever pitch, people are going to move. And it's difficult now. I was actually reading this social or political scientist. This has worked in the past. So the New Deal, there was some Republican support, although it was a Democratic policy. But the fact is that for most of American history, we've had one party with a long majority and then a minority party, which meant that the minority party was incentivized to collaborate and cooperate because that was the only way that they were going to get any of their stuff in. Whereas now the House and Congress switches all the time. So it's much more of a zero-sum scorched earth approach, right? To get back power, you have to make the other side look horrible and blah, 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 blah. But I think that given what was going to happen with the climate crisis and how big it will be, there will be a point where both parties have to do something about it. The issue is that once they start to do something, will we actually have the systems in place to allow that work to happen the ways that it needs to happen? And then as far as fossil fuel, how are you going to deal with that infrastructure? Think about it a lot, and there's a lot of tax. Some people talk about going purely through a financialization tax, where you're sort of trying to get these loans thought of differently about risk and how risky, say, building a new pipeline is when you have to switch. Like that project shouldn't be getting, they probably had to get some amount of private capital. They shouldn't have gotten it, right? Like that is that should be considered an incredibly risky loan. And it's not for lots of reasons. So that's one way people think about it. There's other conversations that people have about stranded asset buyouts, which is that when you have something like a Green New Deal, you just buy out all of the fossil fuel infrastructure or legislatively force it to shut down. One commitment that people at state levels are making that I think it would make sense to make at a federal level is no new fossil fuel infrastructure. Right? It's just day one, you just can't keep building this stuff. And so there's a lot of ways. This is a very long way of saying there's a lot of ways to crack that nut. And what ultimately we're trying to figure out is which way fits best with the rest of the Green New Deal. And how that would work most smartly and elegantly and hurt people the least. Right. And that's the biggest, what it will allow the transition to happen the most justly.
I would just add very quickly to that. I mean, direct action. The role of people who've put their bodies on the line to stop extraction has been huge. I mean, I think that AOC was radicalized at Dakota, the fight over the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock. And I also think, just by the way, I mean, I think the New York Times has been shaming bus drivers who let people on who can't afford to pay are heroes. They're climate heroes, in the same way that people who put their bodies on the line are. So direct action to make public services accessible, direct action to stop fossil fuel extraction. This is part of the puzzle. It might not be something you can say if you have a certain relationship to the political system, but I think that... Go do action. They don't
yeah. Evelina, do you want to say something? So I guess we're going to take one last question, and everybody can have kind of one final say. Just strikes me one thing, if we want evidence of how quickly a political party can change its views and its whole operation, look at the Republican Party in the last 3 years. It's completely transformed from what it was, because everyone wants to get behind where they think the popular will in their district is. And that's been an amazing and radical transformation, and tells you, I think, about possibilities in the other direction as well. All right, the last question.
Two quick, closely related questions. The first is that one of the things that made the New Deal itself successful politically, and that makes the defense industry quite successful politically even now, is that there were projects, or are projects, in literally every congressional district of the country, right? Red or blue, right? And it seems to me that that's a key to making the Green New Deal politically saleable as well, so I'm wondering your thoughts on that. The second and related question is that presumably we want the Green New Deal to operate at every sort of level of government, and then entirely across the spectrum from public sector to private sector. We want kind of coordination along both of those dimensions. It seems to me that to make that work, we ought to be having, even now, before we get the right people in office, a series of town hall meetings across the country to get communities to start thinking together, collaboratively deliberating together, with a view to determining what projects they actually need in their districts now, so that then again we can sort of start hitting the ground running as soon as we have the right people in office.
Any final thoughts from the panel, and then we're going to wrap.
No, I absolutely agree. I was even going to say, when we were talking about institutional capacity, the mobile libraries during the New Deal, like the women on horses that went to like the most remote areas to deliver books. And so not that, it's a whole different world now, but what I'm saying is that, we did cover every corner of the country. We provided public service in every corner of the country. It materially changed people's lives. And I think that this social justice approach that has the jobs guarantee part of it is this sort of institutional mechanism that says, have a planning period, get your local constituencies, let them meet, let them do their list of desirable projects. And the way I would think of them would be projects that would be befitting different skills, and there would be more projects that they might be people in the community that would need to do them. And I'm quite confident that this would be the case for most communities, that there's more work to be done than actually you can get hands to do them. So that would be one way of thinking about sort of, democratizing and creating constituencies across the board. And then the job guarantee, along with the other programs like Medicare, tuition-free college, etc., those I would see them as absolutely the responsibility of the public sector and provide the strength and the social safety net. Then the technological aspects of the transition, like there's got to be some cooperation, collaboration with private industry using advanced technology, and then we need to figure out, what is the nature of that collaboration as well.
Okay, hold on. Okay, so always thinking ahead. So just two quickly kind of broad answers. I mean, one, a lesson from the New Deal, one from Latin America. I think from the New Deal, FDR was elected promising a 25% cut in federal expenditure. And what happens over the course of the New Deal is that there is an experimental ethos. There is mass mobilization, often talked about from unions, but also from people who are retired or about to retire, rural America basically in revolt because they had no money. And what happened over the course of the New Deal was that the policies and the people behind the policies that were most successful in meeting people's needs won popular support and survived and thrived. And by the way, public recreation was one of them. Robert Moses had 1,800 people in New York City working for him, building swimming pools, public beaches, Orchard Beach, Rockaway Beach. Many cities had numbers of parks, something like triple. So you have a public theater in New York. Yeah, Apollo Theater. I mean, the entire black theater scene in Harlem, a lot of that money from New Deal. So Jewish dictionaries. Howard Hopkins said to Republicans, they demanded, why are you paying for Jewish dictionaries? They said they were rabbis in the unemployment rolls. Now they have a job. What's your problem? Now the people doing infrastructure folk worried about corruption. Howard Hopkins worried about giving people jobs. It's a good division of labor. So there's a ratchet effect between spending, building support, good ideas. The bad ideas get thrown out. The good ideas, people mobilize behind them. And so if you can think of this as an era and you can build enough mass mobilization, but my quibble with some of my friends on the left, I think they underestimate the power of public spending to strengthen constituencies, which can then in turn do some of the work of selecting the most effective projects. Okay, that's one. The lesson from Latin America, which also has this ratchet, and there's been a lot of time in Latin America where the Latin American left has been very strong and is now not, is that there was mass mobilization. There were massive social service expenditures to help people lift out of poverty, and the left governments came to believe that they could tell the business community what to do in meetings. And the business community threw them out. And we saw this most powerfully in Brazil. The Dilma government said, we have to bring industrial policy back to this country. We're going to build an iPad. People forget, the New York Times had an article, the US can't get an iPad factory in the US, but Dilma got one in Brazil. But 2 years later, the business class said, you're out. And the people, essentially, workers, unions, housing movements had been so demobilized by intentional policies that they were not on the streets. So I think the idea that you can, in meetings, do industrial policy is not enough. You need to have the mass mobilization. So we're in for an extremely contentious 10, 20, 30 years with very bad weather along the way. That's just what's going to happen. I still think we can win. We can make a much better century than the 20th century, which was a bloodbath and horrifying. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be settled in meetings alone.
Rihanna.
Yes to having something in every congressional district. I never even thought about it in those terms because the Green New Deal has to happen everywhere, right? So I was just like, yes, sounds right. I agree. And then I think all of the lessons, that Daniel and Pavlina said are exactly correct. I think this has to be thought of as an era of experimentation. And the mobilization, the Green New Deal is set out for a 10-year mobilization. So even within that 10 years, that's a decade. That's a decade of work. We've done we did most of the damage for climate change in 30 years. Right? So a decade, people like to say you can't do it, it's basically tomorrow. It's not. It's actually literally not tomorrow. So I think that is really important to remember. And I forgot the rest of my thoughts, so I'm going to end here.
Well, I'm going to say one more thing, which is that for those of you who've been coming around IPK, you know that a lot of the energy and resources and personnel we've had here over the last several years have come through this Rebuild by Design competition, which we had because of Sandy. Rebuild by Design was President Obama's policy response to get us thinking about, collectively about creative ways of rebuilding. What we need to do now is have a pro-Build by Design project, not just at NYU and IPK, but at every major university that's doing research, where we need to be thinking about how to create the world that we need to live in, the infrastructure we need, the structure, the economy, the social policies, before the next disaster happens, to avert the next disaster, but to make something better. And it's that kind of proactive engagement in the world that I think universities can do really well. Universities aren't the only ones who can do that. I think there's a lot of organizations, but you asked, where's the town hall meeting? The way we did it after Sandy is we said, if the university's not going to do it, no one's going to. And we have some credibility as people who are interested in ideas and research and who are open-minded. And I really like to see IPK step up to do that work, and I'd like to see IPK in partnership with institutes and centers and universities around the world in that kind of project, and maybe we can all find ways of working together to make that happen. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panel for coming. Keep coming back.